Ah oui, oh hey, ah oui, oh hey, oh. For thousands of years, the Ganyangahaga, Mohawk, have lived under the great law of peace within the St. Lawrence Valley.
Pendant des milliers d'années, les Ganyangahaga, les Mohawks, ont habité en paix dans la vallée du Saint-Laurent.
500 years ago, we encountered a new people
Et il y a 500 ans, on a rencontré un nouveau peuple
that changed the relationship between the people and the land.
qui a changé les relations entre les gens et avec la terre.
From the plains of Abraham
Des plaines d'Abraham
to the Oka crisis of 1990,
jusqu'à la crise d'Oka de 1990,
to the modern-day relationship between the Quebecois and the Ganyangahaga.
jusqu'à l'ère moderne de la relation entre les Québécois et les Ganyangahaga.
We will examine the things that have divided us,
On va examiner les choses qui nous ont divisés
the things that we have in common,
et les choses qu'on a en commun.
our historical relationship,
Notre relation historique
and where we will go together in the future.
et où qu'on s'en va ensemble dans le futur.
Join us in our journey back to our integrity.
Joignez-vous à nous dans notre retour à notre intégrité.
Ah oui, oh hey, ah oui, oh hey, oh, hey, oh, ah oui, oh hey, oh hey, ah oui, oh, ah oui, oh, ah oui, oh hey, ah oui, oh hey, oh, ah oui, oh.
Bonjour la création, mon nom c'est Edith, fille de Socorro Castellan et petite fille qui portait en vie le nom de Francisca Rueda, de la nation Zapotèque et née au territoire Mexica, sous la protection du clan Zulu, du conseil traditionnel Ganyangahaga de la Confédération des 5 nations à Kahnawà, la Maison, longue. Nous remercions la femme ciel qui nous donne notre esprit, nous remercions notre grand-mère lune qui nous donne notre sang, et notre mère terre qui nous donne notre corps, et à toutes les femmes, de la toute petite nouvelle-née jusqu'à la plus aînée, parce qu'elles sont toutes les mères de nos nations. Nous remercions toutes les médecines, toutes les eaux, les arbres, les oiseaux, les animaux. On remercie tout ce qui nous donne vie. On fait appel au véritable esprit de la Gayanara Saragoa, la grande loi de la paix, et du Wampum à du voit. Et on fait appel à nos ancêtres afin qu'ils nous aident à rétablir ces relations harmonieuses, en équilibre, en bonne pensée et en bon esprit. Et tout ce qui n'est pas là pour cette bonne pensée, que ça soit repoussé dans les 3 niveaux de l'existence. Bonjour la création, mon nom c'est Edith, fille de Socorro Castellan et petite fille qui portait en vie le nom de Francisca Rueda, de la nation Zapotèque et née au territoire Mexica, sous la protection du clan Zulu, du conseil traditionnel Ganyangahaga de la Confédération des 5 nations à Kahnawà, la Maison, longue. Nous remercions la femme ciel qui nous donne notre esprit, nous remercions notre grand-mère lune qui nous donne notre sang, et notre mère terre qui nous donne notre corps, et à toutes les femmes, de la toute petite nouvelle-née jusqu'à la plus aînée, parce qu'elles sont toutes les mères de nos nations. Nous remercions toutes les médecines, toutes les eaux, les arbres, les oiseaux, les animaux. On remercie tout ce qui nous donne vie. On fait appel au véritable esprit de la Gayanara Saragoa, la grande loi de la paix, et du Wampum à du voit. Et on fait appel à nos ancêtres afin qu'ils nous aident à rétablir ces relations harmonieuses, en équilibre, en bonne pensée et en bon esprit. Et tout ce qui n'est pas là pour cette bonne pensée que ça soit repoussé dans les 3 niveaux de l'existence.
Good morning, it's Jean-Jacques Nantel. I will speak English for Stuart. Okay, to understand the episode today is about the Iroquois and the Québécois before the British conquest. The Québécois were not a nation before they came into Quebec. A nation, it's the country which creates the nation and not the nation which creates the country. The reason why Québécois came to Canada in the first place was because of something which happened between the 12th and the 15th century in Europe. It was the Renaissance, where the Europeans learned back everything they knew about science, and they started to improve their weaponry, their boats and everything, which created an explosion coming from Europe, especially demographic, economic, military, and they invaded the world. In the Americas, there were 3 types of colonization. The first one was a colonization of robbers. It was the Spaniards, the Portuguese in South America, Central America, the English, the French, the Dutch in the Caribbean, the English in the southern USA. That was, they stole the gold and the silver from the Aboriginals, and after they used slavery to get rich without working. The second type of colonization was in northern USA. It was the Americans. It was the surplus of population coming from Europe. They came on the East Coast. They made a lot of kids. They brought millions of immigrants. And they moved west to occupy the land, and of course against the First Nations. The third type of colonization was in Quebec. It was the French who wanted to do a commercial colonization. That colonization was a colonization based on, with friendship with the Aboriginals. This is the reason why it was a commercial colony. It was for a geopolitical reason. In North America, all the geographic axes are north-south. The East Coast, the West Coast, the Mississippi River, the Appalachian Mountains, the Rocky Mountains, all those things are north-south. There is one gigantic exception. It's the St. Lawrence River. The St. Lawrence River is so important that it's the only river on the planet which is visible from the moon. That river gives access to the largest internal sea of the world, the Great Lakes, which give access to the richest continent on the planet, North America. The French came in Canada to use that waterway to get to the furs, which were the main wealth in Canada. We had no gold, no silver, nothing. And they came here. You don't kill your clients. Then they came in Tadoussac first, Acadia first, after Tadoussac, and they were bringing to the First Nation things which were very valuable, things in metal, axes, knives, things like that. And the First Nation were selling us in exchange furs, which were very valuable in Europe. And we came as friends. Then they asked us to create Quebec City, and the best proof of that is that Champlain came in 1608, and in 1609 we had they asked us to come and go and fight against the Iroquois in the future New York State. And we have also the name of the first, the chief of Trois-Rivières, who asked us to create Trois-Rivières. And that was the reason why Quebec was founded, to make commerce. Then it's the time to Stuart to give us the first impression of the Mohawk when they received the colonization.
Well, Scanagoa, everybody. Bonjour tout le monde. Gazit Danzariu Yujits, Gahoe Nuji and Dujits Gwainista. My name is Gazit Danzariu. This is the name that my mother has given me, and while she was alive in this world, she carried the sacred title of Wolf Clan Mother. As you may know, that the Ganyangahanga, which you know as the Mohawk, that we are a matrilineal society. So as a matrilineal society, whenever we do anything, whenever we counsel or ceremony, that we have to carry out Ahonda Gariwadekwa. This is the words that come before all else. This is what Edith has done, given the thanks. But when I speak, I have to remind myself of basically the 3 levels of my origins, 3 levels of creation. And so I give thanks. We say, Deiti Nura Dogorunga Gariyo Gesu. Yeti Sota Asatanka Grako Dana Yeti Nestanzia Hunzage. And this is that I give thanks to the original body within the physical realm. And this is what we identify as Sky Woman. We give thanks to her because she has given us spirit. Then we give thanks to our grandmother Moon, the beating heart of our Mother Earth. It is she who gives us blood. And then we give thanks to our Mother Earth, as you know, as you just described. She is the mother of us all. We all, regardless of if we come from Europe or if we come from here, our Mother Earth has given birth to all of us, and so this makes us all family. As the history that you described, over the generations, people have become separated and broken apart from their family, and something very important happened in Europe that is forgotten by the European, is that in order to have a renaissance, like what you described, that means that some trauma had to have happened to the society, to the entire society, in order to remember what was forgotten. So there was trauma there that basically it kind of like wiped the memory of the non-native people throughout Europe, as to get them to start warring upon each other, get them to forget about their family ties, their family connections. But here within Turtle Island, this is what happened with the Ganyangahanga. We slipped into the same thing of which is referred to as the Dark Ages. We slipped into war, and when people are at war, then it causes disease, it causes famine, it destroys the land because you ravage the land, you cut down the trees for material. So war has a devastating effect not only on the people that are fighting, it has a devastating effect upon the land, and therefore then it translates into the animals, the wildlife. And so when you consider that we need the wildlife to as food, as furs and all these things, if we're at war, then there's no wildlife, which means then it translates into that the society becomes very poor, very unhealthy, very sick. We were at once in these dark ages, which was disease, pestilence, famine, the same way as it was throughout Europe and the other side of the world. And when we consider, we ask ourselves, what was the circumstances of the Dark Ages? And then you got to ask yourself, well, when did the Dark Ages end? They never ended. In the non-native world, the Dark Ages have not ended. Here, the Dark Ages have ended for us, and how it ended is that the men had to stop warring, climb up the evolutionary ladder to be at the level of the women, where we can then start to evolve together in the world. And this was known as, or identified as, the Gayanarasara, which is quite simply the great good, meaning the great balance, the balance between the female and the male, to which is where in the non-native world there's a great imbalance between the male and the female, where the male goes against the actual process of creation, where we know that the process of creation identifies clearly to us, I am born of woman. So we could trace our lineage back to an original woman. So when in the non-native world, when they identify God as male, then this is where the root of the corruption begins, where the imbalance starts, because it takes away the primary, the female, who is the original being, and it places us, male, above them. And that distorts the entire creation after that. So the Ganyangahanga, being matrilineal, we were in war. It's the same as the European, but the difference with us is we came to the level of peace to evolve with the women, pull ourselves out of the dark ages, and then this, as you identified, the richest continent on the planet, it translates into how the life on the land prospers. So the Great Peace, the matrilineal society, had a great benefit upon the land, which to this day the Quebecois are benefiting from so much that, like you said, it's part of the richest place on the planet.
Well, that's what you said is very interesting, because it was a matrilinear society on the Mohawk side, and the Quebecois who came here first, they were massively males. Very few women. The encounter of the two nations was from those two different backgrounds. When the Quebecois came on the St. Lawrence River, they wanted to go west to do commerce. It was not an invasion. Only 2,600 Frenchmen left descendants in North America. It was not an invasion. It was a commercial colony with a lot of upper classes, and they moved west to go to the furs. And what really happened was that the Mohawk, the reason why we had that war, those wars with the Mohawk, the Iroquois from 1609 till 1701 when we signed the peace, it was because it was a geopolitical reason. It was not a racial reason. It was not religious. It was a language. It was commerce. Because you had the St. Lawrence River, which was the main artery to go to the center of the continent. But you had also a small competing valley, which is the Valley of the Mohawk, where live even today the 5 Iroquois nations. And they were competing for the furs. Then the Iroquois was on the southern side, on the English side, and they were taking the furs from the center of the continent through Lake Erie, the Mohawk River, till Albany, where they sold it to the Dutch and then to the English, and they went down to New York. While the Aboriginals in the St. Lawrence Valley was selling their furs to the French. And the war between the French and the Iroquois was in Montreal, near the Ontario and Erie Lake, because the Erie Lake is 100 meters higher than the Ontario Lake. Then the French had a tendency to go north towards Lake Huron, where were the Huron and all the allies of the French. Then, and this is very important, when the French came, they wanted to do business. So did the Mohawk, so did the Iroquois and the English. And in North America, as soon as Quebecers, they came from all over France. You know, it was people, nobody knows where they came from. We came from Normandy, from Ile-de-France, the region of Paris, from all over France. When they came into Quebec, there is a valley there, and the valley of the St. Lawrence, and they became a nation. Then you had very quickly, 50 years, it was a nation. And the English were in New England. And they became a nation also, because it's the country which creates the nation. And you had France and England fighting. Then in North America, you had 3 parallel wars. The French against the English. It was a European war transposed to North America.
Yeah.
You had the Quebecois against the Americans. And you had the northern Aboriginals against the southern Aboriginals, the Iroquois. And the fighting was for the furs. And those 3 wars, each of the 6 groups tried to get advantage by using their allies. And the French, they had an immense coalition with them. And the French, what they did, they took the Mississippi River, which is on the western side of the Appalachian Mountains. And the French took the 2 extremities of to get the furs out, to bring them to Europe, to make money. It was the St. Lawrence River, Quebec, and the Louisiana. In the middle, you had the Aboriginals, who were our allies, because we followed the rivers to take out the furs and to bring them the tools they wanted, the First Nations. And that was the main alliance in North America. The English, everybody understood, especially the First Nation then, that the English were coming to take the land, and they were fighting. The main problem in North America was the French Quebecer First Nation coalition behind the Appalachian Mountains, and the other side was the English who were moving west. And that was the main alliance, and it was for economic reason for the French, but it was a conquest from the English, which were, in 1760 they were 1.5 million. We were only 70,000. We made a lot of babies, but 70,000, it's nothing. The coalition was an equilibrium because the Aboriginals were many, hundreds of thousands, born guerrilleros in forests. It's impossible to conquer a continent like that if you're not millions. And they were getting help from the French. Then, let's give you to see your point of view on that part of history.
Yeah, it's very interesting. There's something that you said earlier about 3 different types of invasion. What you said earlier about the British, the French, and the Spanish. It's very important. Most people don't ever think about those 3 different types of invasion or colonization that came here. People just think today of, if they even think colonization, they'll just think of the European. They won't think of French, British, Spanish. Very different, those 3. As the world may know, or much of the world has forgotten, that the Spanish in coming here were the most brutal. They were physically, they were crazy. They were just murderers. That's all they were. Crazy, lust for blood and lust for gold, and kill anything in its way. The British, same way. They are the same thing, but it's more. They use more trickery. They hide behind. We call it hiding behind butterflies. That they'll create They'll create lies. They'll tell lies. And they'll utilize those lies to as trickery, like they utilize the lies to get us to be involved in something like the Treaty of Montreal, which you gave reference to earlier. 1901. Yeah. Anyways, the French, very different. There is a reality of when you look at, if you can physically look at the, imagine a native village, and then you see these three different strains of invasion coming. So now the Spanish, what they did was they were completely separate from the native village, and they would wake up in the morning, come into the native village, ravage, rape, kill, murder, and then go back into their camp. The British, they were close. We intermingled. There was, on the people level, on the personal level, there was interaction. But they were still linked to their camp. They were not like a direct interaction with us. The difference with the French is there was direct interaction. There was a different spirit behind the invasion. Mind you, it was still an invasion. It was still a colonization, but it was a different spirit that the people had. The Spanish, the people had no level of freedom. You could say almost no level of free thought, because they would just do whatever their king would tell them to do. The British, the same thing, a little bit more leeway in as far as their personal freedom goes, but the French, a lot more freedom. A lot more freedom as like the thought of pursuing their personal freedom, their personal affecting into the world, like a peace or a better relationship anyways when they came. The fact is that with the French, we had, as you know, the thing of the voyageur. We didn't have voyageur with the British. We didn't have voyageur with the Spanish. You know, with the British, the closest you came was the expeditions that went out west. And then that was basically, you had a native who was a slave and who was just there to for the relations with the other native people. But with the French, it was more of a partnership, more of like a family. Like they came here to visit. They were still under again, like I said, the invasion. They were still colonizers. But they, again, when they came here, the personal freedom that they had in their minds clashed with their king. So what happened, as I'm sure you're aware of this, as the French first came here, as you said, there was only a few
handful,
and it was men. So obviously, we had to interrelate, and this meant that we became family. As we became family, we began our trade, like what you said earlier about when the non-native came here and they seen the native people, that the native people wanted to trade. It wasn't that way. It may have appeared that way, because you have to understand that we never had the concept of trade the way that the non-native does. Because in the non-native world, it's not trade, it's commodification. That it's all commodified, so there is a different type of value on whatever the good is that you're talking about. So when the non-native came here, and if it was like, say for instance, like a beaver pelt, that is something that we shared. We traded. There's a difference to when you're selling something. We never had that concept the way that the non-native did.
Maybe, but human beings are all over we're the same. We're the same genes, everything is similar. Mm-hmm. People like what is more efficient. When the French came in Canada, we embraced the more Aboriginal way of living. We took many things, la crosse, we took the pemmican, everything, because you were adapted to the continent. We were not. And we took everything. In our culture, it's full of things which came from the First Nation technologies. But we brought technologies to the Aboriginals. For example, when we brought, the pot, metal pot, it was much easier for the women in the First Nation to boil water in a metal pot rather than throwing, stone that you put in fire. It was more efficient, and they wanted it. Just to give you an example, which is very famous, it's the glass pearl that the French brought from Europe. They could make very beautiful, nice coats with it because it was beautiful. They wanted it. The demand was enormous, and the French were bringing it to the Aboriginals. Quebecers never, ever put the First Nation in camps or in reserves. Mm-hmm. We were intermingling with them. The Métis Nation all over North America were French-speaking because we lacked women. Then we married women. In the time of Jean Talon, 50 years after the 1608 Quebec Foundation, 1/3 of the men were leaving the colony to live in the West with women, Indian women. We were really an alliance. The thing is, and this is very important, the reason why the First Nation lost the Americas, yes, there were genocide in the South and everything, but normally it's impossible to do something like that because it takes centuries to bring millions of people on a new continent. The reason why the First Nation lost the Americas, it's because of epidemics. Epidemics are the most important factor in history. It's more important than wars, than massacre, genocide, or whatever, because that's what happened in Canada. We were very few, 70,000 in 1760. Our allies were hundreds of thousands, but declining, falling, collapsing, while the English, they were multiplying, doubling every 25 years. And it took centuries to reach the Pacific coast. Normally, think Africa. Africa has been, they took people, they killed people, genocide, they displaced tens of millions of them in the Americas. Today, it's 99% African. Why? Because they didn't have epidemics. They were in the old continent, and they got all those diseases. When the whites came here, and they didn't know that, the whites didn't know that, they brought with them in their blood 20, 30 diseases, and the Aboriginals had no immune system against it. And all of a sudden, they died, 20% from measles, 30% from yellow fever, 20, 30 diseases. And those diseases started with Christopher Columbus, and they reached Alaska centuries before the first white man went to Alaska. Mm-hmm. Because those are epidemics. From Aboriginal to an Aboriginal, it went. Then, when they came in North America, they just moved west, taking the land, and the Aboriginals were collapsing. They kept collapsing, and they are still in Amazonia and in the Inuits because they don't have the immune system against epidemics. Yeah. This is very important. And something I wanted to say is that when the Iroquois suffered the epidemics in the 17th century, they discovered that they had to make peace with the French. And that's the reason why they did that in 1701, despite the fact that they were in competition, the two valleys I was talking about. And this was very important. And when, I will finish with it, when the Aboriginals behind the Appalachian Mountains, they realized that the English were moving west, that was the main conflict in North America. The English moving west and the Aboriginal in the center trying to impede them to pass. And the French and the Quebecois were only there to help the First Nation. Not because they wanted to help them, because they wanted to impede the English to take the continent. Mm-hmm. And that was the origin of the peace that we signed in 1701. We had to stop fighting because the movement of the English, it was tremendously powerful. And that's the reason why the First Nation lost the continent. In Africa, the blacks took back the continent as soon as they learned the technologies of the Western world. Your turn.
I think that perceptions, of course, are different depending on what side of the issue that you're on. I'll say to you that the original peoples here never lost the continent. I'll say that land was lost, but it's not the original people here who lost land. I'll say it was you who lost land. The land that you lost, if you look on the map, you'll see Europe is separate from so-called North and South America, what we identify as Turtle Island. You no longer have Europe. You lost it.
As I said, it's the country creates the people, not the people creates the country. Quebecers knew they were a nation 50 years after the foundation of Quebec because it was obvious. And the French who came in Quebec, they were talking about the Canadians. It was us, the Canadian. It was a nation. But we lost Europe because it's not our continent. My continent, it's America. It's like the Boers in South Africa. They are white Africans.
Where you are now. But when you look at like what you identified about Africa, as the invasion went to Africa, but you identify that now it's 95% African, well, it's because now you're looking at the end of a process. The non-native doesn't realize is that they're coming up to an end of a process where when you get to the end of a process, that's when you'll see the true outcome of that process. And the process here of what we're talking about is the invasion. The invasion of, if we draw a parallel from our bodies to our Mother Earth, it's easier to look at it this way sometimes because people, when you factor in people, then we get emotional about the issue or whatever. But if you consider, like in your body, you have the different organs, internal organs. Now imagine if your liver decided to go over to the lungs and colonize the lungs and say, okay, everybody in the lungs now, you're going to live like the liver. And then if they did that in the rest of the organs in the body, well, what would happen is you would eventually have just one internal organ, and that would mean that your body would not be able to live. Your body would die. This is the process that has been happening upon the earth, what humans have been doing. The humans that came out of basically from Western Europe, from Europe. It's the European male-dominant mentality that has spread throughout the world. And who has really carried that mentality has been the British, carried the imperial male-dominant mentality. This is basically the worst traits, human traits that anybody could have or exhibit. It's the conduct that a person has once they are in that imperial mentality. Then after that, their conduct, they're no longer in control of their individual conduct. It is like puppets, where like marionettes that are controlled then by higher up. And this is the reason why Britain or the English has been so successful in spreading basically like this virus. It is basically like a cancer that is spread around the world, and it is because of that male dominant mentality, that imperialistic thing that has traveled from, if you want to say, like from early Greek to Romans to throughout Europe until it has taken root. And finally today is only represented now today in the world by the only empire remaining, which is Britain, still controlling the world. And this is the end of the process that we are at now. So at the end of the process, once this grip is loosened on the world, freedoms start to come into the minds of the people, which is why at this time you have, like right now, you look in the world, you have Catalonia, Spain, that is pushing. Now imagine in Europe for part of Spain, or imagine part of Britain or part of France trying to separate today. You know, that wouldn't happen even in the last 500 years. So the only reason why that is happening today is because we can see that we are now at the end of a process, which Catalonia, Spain, we find has a lot in common now with Quebec, with the Quebecois. And this is where we identify that, mind you, I'll say, when we were talking earlier, I said, vive la Quebec libre. Mm-hmm. Now, I believe that. I believe not just vive le Québec libre. I believe the world. For the world, it must be free. So anybody that is within an oppressive situation, circumstances, of course, we support their bid for freedom. So we do identify and we support that the Quebecois, today, they must separate themselves from the rest of the insanity of the rest of the world. They have to separate themselves from the capitalistic practices. They got to separate themselves from the false man-made governmental systems, the false educations, the false religions that are imposing wars upon people constantly. The Quebecois has to separate from these things, and the reason why, basically, is because we are here.
You know, I agree with you that that we are on the same tune. We have to solve. I always think, there is a Frenchman called René Dubois. He said, think globally, act locally. We have a problem on the planet. The planet is dying. We have to save it. And in order to save it, we have to start working where we live. In Canada, in Quebec, in Canada, in North America, in the world, nobody is going nowhere. Nobody is going nowhere. In Quebec, French, Canadian are going to stay here. The First Nation are going to stay here. We have to find a way to live together in a peaceful way. Today, wars, it almost implies atomic bombs. Then it's very dangerous. That's why I say, I want to solve the problem with the First Nation, not because I feel guilt. I feel no guilt at all, no responsibility for what happened to the First Nation. I didn't do that. My family didn't do that. My nation didn't do that. The British put the First Nation in reservation and they stole the land. We didn't. We were friends with them. Then the reason why I want to do that, it's not out of guilt. It's because it's right. Because it's their rights. It belongs to them. If if you have something which belongs to the First Nation, you must give it to them. If there is something which belongs to the French Canadian, it belongs to them. Same thing with the English-speaking Quebecers. The problem in Canada is not the English language. It's not the English-speaking Quebecers. It's not Ottawa. It's not the English Canadian. It's the system. The system has been invented by a nation of thieves who invaded us, who stole the land from us, French-speaking Quebecers, and from the First Nation. And they transmitted it from great-grandfather to grandfather to father to son to grandson up until today. We have to change that system. And the Aboriginals, the First Nation, and the Quebecois must recreate the alliance we had between 1701 and 1760, where even the Iroquois were our friends, our allies, in order to solve the problem locally. And if we solve the problem locally, we will start solving the problem internationally. That's what I believe we have to do, and I believe that's what I just said.
We identify the system that you're talking about. We identify it as democapitalism. People believe that they are in a democracy, and everybody has a concept of what democracy is. But everybody's concept of democracy is totally wrong. Totally. Everybody associates democracy with freedom and representation of people. That is not true. It has never been true. You think of what your perception of democracy is today. Throw it out the window. Go back in time to the originators of democracy. Not you today who wants to interpret or believe it means freedom or whatever. Go to the originators and let's see what democracy was. Well, you know what democracy was. Democracy was slavery. Democracy was war. Democracy was where the women were not even considered people, where the women were owned by the men, where they were not citizens, where democracy was, like you said earlier, thieves, because the people who created democracy, what they did was they would go and sack towns, go and ravage a village, and then they would send in one of their.
You're talking about the British or the Greeks?
I'm talking about the early Greeks, the early Romans, going right up until the British. It's all the same line. Okay. Because, as you know, as the Greeks, the Romans made their way eastward, it basically ends up in Britain today, which is which is where the emperor is now today. It is still there, but anyways, that the democracy is not what people believe. It's not what, when you consider the last election here in Quebec, when Pauline Marois was still in as the premier of Quebec. Yeah. Okay, everybody in Quebec believed in the process. Everybody had complete faith in their political process and in the democratic process. They all went and voted, and you look at what happened to Quebec. If I forget when exactly the election was. I think it was on a Monday or Tuesday. On a Thursday, a couple of days after that election, the courts, the Superior Court of Quebec, identified that any businesses here now no longer had to have French language in their signage. So you voted on a Monday or a Tuesday. In the elections, in democracy, everybody thought and understood. They knew what they were doing here in Quebec. And then on Thursday, everything that the Quebecois had fought for the last 30, 40 years was lost, just like that.
Don't forget that a right comes from force. Brute force or the force of the number. Quebecers, for example, in 1995, I'm talking about Quebecois, French-speaking Quebecois, they voted 60% yes to negotiate with English Canada. And it was the ethnic group, they were deceived by propaganda. They voted no, and it was blocked. And it was because of the number. In history, there are three things which are very important, and it's important for you, the First Nation. The first thing is the number you are. The second thing is the number you are. The third thing is the number you are. The number is history. Demography is destiny. And this is precisely what we should talk in the next program of this series.
I would say to you that, of course, we have two opposite perceptions here. In the native world, it has nothing to do with the number that we are. In the native world, it has to do with law and truth. And law and truth has nothing to do with numbers. As you can see within democracies such as Canada, the amount of people has nothing to do with law or truth. So as we know here in Canada, that the truth is not what the people are living by, and the fact is that the amount of people actually changes or devolves the what happens in the society. Take for instance, we identify that Canada is a rape culture because the society, the collective, finds it acceptable for there to be rape. And anybody listening right now will say, no, that's not true. But the reality is through the courts that rape is accepted. You live in a rape culture. So the amount of people doesn't improve or make things right or true. It actually degrades the people, their standard of living.